So in this learning objective, we're going to be talking about solving quadratics by factoring. So just a couple of things before we start. First of all, quadratics is a term that's going to get used a lot this unit, and a quadratic is just when we have that x squared. So our traditional form looks like this. All right, so that's our kind of traditional quadratic, but the important thing being there's that exponent of 2. All right, the other thing before we start is that we're talking about solving these things by factoring. All right, so factoring is something that we learned in a previous unit and a previous learning objective in this unit. All right, so just make sure that you kind of review factoring, even if you pass it the first time on the pre-assessment or last unit. All right, just make sure you know how to factor these quadratics, or else you won't be able to do this learning objective either. All right, so the first thing is this thing about 0. So 0 is actually kind of a special number. And the main thing is, if you multiply anything by 0, it becomes 0. All right, and also, kind of, I don't have it on the slide, but also if you multiply two things together, the only way you can multiply to give 0 is if one of those two things is 0. It's not possible to multiply two non-zero things and get 0. So 0 is this kind of unique thing when we're talking about multiplication, and that's going to help us solve equations. All right, so for instance, in this equation, all right, 5x equals 0, 5 times something equals 0. Well, the only way something can be multiplied to give 0 is if that thing is 0. And of course, we could see this another way. We could just divide both sides by 5 and see that x has to be 0. All right, this is that kind of 0 property. The only way you can multiply to give 0 is if one of the things is 0. And here's where that's going to come up in solving equations. All right, so we have x minus 3 times, all right, again, there's kind of that multiplication that's happening there. X minus 3 times x plus 4 equals 0. It's real important it's equal to 0 because we're going to use that 0 property. So if we're multiplying to give 0, one of these things has to be 0. So one of the things could be x minus 3, could be equal to 0. Right. So if we're saying this is going to be 0, it doesn't matter what this thing is, because if I have 0 times whatever the other thing is, I'll still get 0 for my final answer. I also have another option. I could say, well, x plus 4 could be 0. And it's the same thing, because if this piece ends up being 0, it doesn't matter what this is, because if I multiply those things together, I'm going to get 0 in the end. It's just a general strategy we end up using, is that when you're multiplying things, you just set those things equal to 0. In this case, we add 3 to both sides to get x equals 3. And in this case, we're going to subtract 4 from both sides to get x equals negative 4. All right, so those are our two answers for this problem, right, because we were using the 0 property to help solve it. All right, and for quadratics, well, we actually just solved a quadratic equation without knowing it. All right, but for some quadratics, all right, like we said at the beginning of the video, we can factor them. All right, so we can factor quadratics, and we break them down into those two parts that look similar to that last example. All right. And if either of those parts is 0, we get a solution to the equation. So basically, we just take these two factors that we get when we factor and set them equal to 0. So that's our general strategy. So again, our strategy, we have this thing equal to 0. So what we can do is factor our quadratic. So we're going to factor this, x squared minus 3x minus 18. I remember with factoring, we're looking at b is negative 3, and ac is negative 18. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 18 and add to negative 3. So that's going to be negative 6 and positive 3. So let's double check. Negative 6 times 3 is negative 18. Negative 6 plus 3 is negative 8. All right, in this specific problem, there is a 1 in front of x squared. There's no number in front of x squared, so we can use the shortcut method of factoring here and just go straight to the factored form. And we get the factored form of our quadratic. And then using our 0 property, it says that now we can take these two things and set them equal to 0. All right, so that's actually the main part of what we're doing in this one. We're using the 0 property. Here we add 6 Here we subtract 3. And that gives us our two answers, 6 and negative 3. All right, in this example, we have to do a little bit of work first. We have 2x squared equals 5x plus 3. First thing to notice is we have this squared, which means we're trying to solve a quadratic equation. Well, right now, the only real way we know how to solve that is by factoring. So when we're doing the factoring method, the first thing we do is get 0 on one side. So I want to move everything on this right-hand side to the left. So I'm going to subtract 5x from both sides, and I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. And that's going to give me 2x squared minus 5x minus 3 equals 0. And again, it's really important that we have 0 over here. All right, we can't use this 0 property unless it's equal to 0. But now we can try to factor that left-hand side. So again, our steps b is negative 5, ac is negative 6. So two numbers that multiply to negative 6 and add to negative 5, that's going to be negative 6 and 1. And here's where it's so important to remember. We do have this number in front of x squared. So we can't do the shortcut method. We can't go directly to the answer. We have to instead do those middle steps of breaking up the term in the middle, factoring as two groups of 2, and then getting our final factored form like that. All right, so don't forget how to factor, and also don't remember you can't always do the shortcut. You can only do the shortcut if there's no number in front of x squared, but when there is a number, we have to do these 3 steps shown here. But now we have it broken down to its factors, and we set those two factors equal to 0. All right, the one on the left, we just have to add 3. The one on the right, we're going to subtract 1, and then divide by positive 2. All right, so we get our two answers, x equals 3 and x equals negative 1/2. All right, but same strategy. So if we break it down into the steps, all right, first step, get 0 on one side, so that's everything above that green line. Second step, factor, all right, so it's everything between those lines. And then you break up your individual factors into pieces. So those are kind of the 3 big steps you have. Get it equal to 0, factor it, set the factors equal to 0. All right, so here's one more. Again, same process. You see this squared here and here, which means we're trying to solve a quadratic equation. If we're solving a quadratic by factoring, the first thing we do is get 0 on one side. Again, it's up to you. I like to keep my x squared terms positive. So if I move this over here, I would get negative 15x squared. I don't really like having my x squared negative, so instead I'm going to move the stuff to the right. So what I'm actually going to do, let me erase that arrow. No, it won't let me erase the arrow, so I'll just leave it. All right, what I'm actually going to do is move this stuff over. So I'm going to get rid of that stuff on the right and move it to the left. All right, so now my equation is 15x squared minus 2x minus 8 equals 0. All right, so that's our first step. Let's put a green line like I had on the last slide. So everything above this green line is our first step of just getting 0 on one side. Now the next thing we're going to do is factor. So to factor, we have to find b is negative 2. ac is negative 120 if you multiply 15 by negative 8. And the two numbers that multiply to negative 120 and add to negative 2 are negative 12 and 10. All right, so now we can do our splitting method because there is a number in front of x squared, so we have to do this splitting method. Factoring is 2 plus 2. The first group I can pull out a 3x. Leaves me a 5x minus 4. Second group 2 I can pull out a 2. So leaves behind 5x minus 4. And now I know my final factored form is the 5x minus 4 and the 3x plus 2 that's left over. All right, so that's our kind of second big step. Again, each one of these steps is multiple things. All right, but our second big step is getting it into its factored form. And our final step is setting those things equal to 0. This one we add 4 and divide by 5. This one we're going to subtract 2 and divide by 3. So we get our final answers. All right, down at the bottom here, all right, x equals 4/5 and x equals negative 2/3. All right, again, breaking up into our steps. First big step is getting 0 on one side, so that's important. Second big step is factoring. Third big step is setting each of those factors equal to 0. All right, so finally, here's a chance for you to try one on your own. All right, solve this quadratic. I already did the first step for you. All right, it's already equal to 0, but you know what to do from there. And here's the solution I got for this one. So again, it's already set equal to 0, so you're going to factor it. All right, once you have it factored, break it up into 2 pieces and set those equal to 0.